My name is Daniel Reeves, and for 8 years, I built a company that didn't legally belong to me. That wasn't a mistake. It wasn't negligence or ignorance or some tragic oversight that would later be framed as poetic justice. It was a decision, deliberate, calculated, and at the time, completely logical. The kind of decision you make when you believe two things without question. First, that the person sitting across from you at the kitchen table is your partner in every sense that matters, and second, that protecting what you're building is more important than claiming credit for it. Back then, Elena and I used to joke that I was the engine and she was the face. She had the charisma, the instinct, the ability to walk into a room full of investors and make them feel like they'd already made money just by listening to her speak. I had the numbers, the architecture, the quiet understanding of how systems actually worked when no one was watching. Together, we were efficient in a way that made success feel inevitable. Separately, we were incomplete. Or at least, that's what I believed for a very long time. The company started in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaking ceiling and a router that had to be reset twice a day. Elena named it Vireon Systems after a bird she said adapted faster than anything else in its environment. I didn't argue with the name. I was too busy writing the back-end infrastructure that would eventually support thousands of users, building it in pieces during nights that bled into mornings, fueled by cheap coffee and the kind of focus that only comes when you're working towards something you think will matter. Elena handled everything external, branding, early outreach, the pitch decks that got us in front of people who would have ignored me entirely if I'd shown up alone. It worked. Within 18 months, we had our first real funding round. Within 3 years, we had an office, a team, and a product that people were starting to take seriously. And here's where the decision happened, the one that would later define everything. The lawyer we consulted during our first funding round laid it out clearly. Structure matters. Ownership matters. Liability matters. At the time, I had a separate consulting business that carried a level of financial risk we didn't want anywhere near Vireon. Lawsuits, contract disputes, the kind of unpredictable exposure that can kill a young company before it has a chance to stand on its own. So we made a choice. We put everything in Elena's name. The company, the equity, the intellectual property, on paper it was hers. Clean, simple, protected. I would remain in the background, unofficial but essential. It wasn't romantic, it was practical. At least that's how we justified it. "You trust me, right?" she asked that night, sitting cross-legged on the floor with legal documents spread out between us. "I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't," I said. She smiled then, the kind of smile that made you feel like you just made the smartest decision of your life. "It's still ours," she said. "This is just paperwork, paperwork." That word would come back later in ways neither of us fully appreciated at the time. For years, the system worked exactly as intended. Elena became the public identity of Vireon Systems. Her name was on every article, every interview, every panel discussion about emerging tech founders who were changing the landscape. I stayed where I was most effective, behind the scenes, building, refining, solving problems before they became visible. When investors had technical questions, Elena would loop me in as our lead architect, a title that sounded important but meant nothing legally. When things broke, and things always break, I was the one who fixed them. Quietly, consistently, without ever needing acknowledgement because the work itself was enough. Or so I told myself. By year 5, Vireon wasn't just stable, it was thriving. We had secured contracts with mid-sized firms, expanded into new markets, and built a reputation for reliability that was rare in an industry full of overpromises and underdelivery. Elena was everywhere by then, podcasts, conferences, magazine profiles that used phrases like self-made innovator and visionary founder. I read those articles sometimes, not out of resentment, not at first. More out of curiosity, like looking at a version of our life that had been edited for public consumption. They weren't lies exactly, just incomplete truths. And incomplete truths, I would learn, are often more dangerous than outright lies. The shift didn't happen all at once, it never does. It was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. Elena started referring to the company as mine instead of ours, small thing, easy to ignore. Then it became my team, my vision, my strategy, still subtle, still defensible if you wanted to give someone the benefit of the doubt. I gave her that benefit longer than I should have. Loyalty has a way of stretching reality until it snaps. By year 7, I was no longer being introduced in meetings unless I explicitly joined them. My role became increasingly internal, increasingly invisible. New hires didn't know who I was unless someone told them. Some assumed I was just another developer. Others thought I was a consultant brought in occasionally. Elena never corrected them, not directly, she just didn't clarify. And silence in those moments did more than any lie could have. I remember the first time it bothered me enough to say something. We were at home, sitting at the same kitchen table where we'd signed those original documents. Different apartment, better lighting, same dynamic, or at least I thought so. You didn't mention me in that interview, I said, keeping my tone neutral. She looked up from her laptop, mildly surprised. Which interview? The one from yesterday, the tech line piece. Oh, she shrugged lightly. It wasn't really about the technical side, it was more about leadership and growth. I built the system they're writing about, Elena. And I built the company that uses it, she replied, not unkindly, just matter of fact. We've always had different roles. That was the first time it felt like a division instead of a partnership. Not loud, not explosive, just a quiet line drawn where there hadn't been one before. I let it go. Of course I did. Because that's what I'd been doing for years, letting things go in service of something bigger. The company mattered, our life together mattered, credit didn't, recognition didn't. Those were surface-level concerns, I told myself. What mattered was what we'd built. What mattered was that it worked. And then in year 8, Elena filed for divorce. There wasn't a dramatic fight leading up to it. No single moment you could point to and say, that's where it broke. It was more like a long, slow drift that eventually became distance, and that distance turned into something neither of us could, or maybe wanted to, close. When the papers came, they were clean, efficient, just like everything else Elena did. Irreconcilable differences, division of assets, ownership claims. I read through them once, then again more slowly. And that's when I saw it, the line that changed everything. Vireon Systems, sole property of Elena Marquez, not disputed, not shared, not even acknowledged as something I might have a claim to. On paper, I was exactly what she had started to treat me as in real life, a non-factor. A man who had been present, perhaps supportive, but ultimately unnecessary to the thing that mattered most. I remember sitting there at the table, the same kind of stillness settling in that only comes when something fundamental shifts inside you. Not anger, not yet, just clarity. 8 years, every line of code, every system architecture decision. Every crisis managed at 3 in the morning when something critical failed and Elena was asleep because she had a keynote the next day. And legally, I was nothing. That's when I realized something Elena hadn't. Yes, everything was in her name. Yes, on paper, she owned the company. But paper, I had learned over the course of my career, is only as strong as the story it can support. And I had 8 years of a very different story. I folded the documents carefully, set them aside, and reached for my phone. There was only one person I needed to call. Marcus, I said when he answered, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. I need you to take a look at something. There was a pause on the other end. Marcus Hale had been my friend for 15 years and my attorney for 10. He knew the difference between a casual question and a problem. How bad is it? He asked. I looked at the papers again, at my absence from every line that mattered. They think I don't exist, I said. Another pause, longer this time. All right, Marcus replied finally, his tone shifting into something sharper, more focused. Then let's figure out how to prove that you do. And that, though I didn't know it yet, was the moment the narrative started to change. Marcus Hale didn't ask me to explain everything over the phone. That was the first sign I'd made the right call. Good attorneys don't build strategies on summaries. They build them on documents, timelines, and the uncomfortable spaces between what people say happened and what actually did. He told me to bring everything I had. Not just the obvious things like bank statements or contracts, but everything, emails, backups, old hard drives, even the kind of records most people forget exist because they were never meant to be evidence in the first place. People think ownership is about what's written down, Marcus said when I walked into his office the next morning, a laptop bag over my shoulder and a cardboard box in my hands. It is, but it's also about what can be proven. And proof has a way of hiding in places people don't clean. Marcus's office was exactly the same as it had been the last time I'd visited 3 years ago. Clean lines, neutral colors, a desk that looked more like a staging area than a workspace. Nothing unnecessary, everything deliberate. He gestured for me to sit and slid a legal pad in front of him, pen already in hand. Start from the beginning, he said, so I did. I told him about the apartment, the leaking ceiling, the first version of Vireon that barely held together under 10 users. I told him about the funding decision, the lawyer's advice, the choice to put everything in Elena's name to shield the company from my consulting exposure. I told him about the growth, the structure, the way we divided responsibilities so completely that from the outside it looked like she was doing everything and I was doing nothing. Marcus didn't interrupt. He wrote occasionally, asked for clarification when timelines overlapped, but mostly he listened. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and tapped his pen once against the paper. All right, he said. On paper, she owns the company. That part is real. We're not going to win this by pretending otherwise. I figured, I said, but, he continued, holding up a finger, ownership and entitlement aren't always the same thing, especially in a marriage. Especially when there's a pattern of contribution that rises above normal spousal support. He stood, walked around his desk, and pulled the box I'd brought closer. Let's see what we've got. The first layer was predictable: bank statements, transfer records, early invoices from vendors who had been paid out of my personal accounts before the company had stable cash flow. Marcus flipped through them quickly, not dismissing them, just categorizing. Useful, he said, but not decisive on their own. Money can be framed as support. Judges see that every day. I know, I replied. That's what her attorney is going to argue, Marcus nodded. Exactly, so we don't start with the money, we start with control. He looked up at me. Tell me about the product, not the pitch. The actual system, that was where things shifted. For the next hour I walked him through the architecture of Vireon, the backend systems, the proprietary optimization model that allowed clients to allocate resources more efficiently, the predictive layer I'd built in year 3 that became the core of our competitive advantage. I explained how it evolved, how each iteration solved a problem the previous version couldn't handle, how the entire system depended on a framework that, while never formally patented, was entirely original. Marcus stopped writing. Do you have proof of that? He asked. Of what? That you built it? I almost smiled. Yeah, I said, I do. The laptop came out next. Most people think of proof in terms of final products, contracts, polished presentations, things that look official. But real proof, the kind that holds up under scrutiny, lives in process, version histories, time-stamped commits. Email threads where ideas are formed, challenged, refined. The unglamorous, messy trail of how something actually comes into existence. I opened the development repository I'd been maintaining since the first week we started building Vireon. It wasn't public, it wasn't branded. It was just mine, years of work stored in a system that tracked every change, every line of code, every decision. Marcus leaned forward. What am I looking at? He asked. A timeline, I said. Every version of the system from day one, who wrote what, when it was written, what changed and why. He watched as I scrolled. There's no one else here, he said after a moment. No, I replied. There isn't. He sat back slowly, the first hint of something like interest turning into something sharper. Does she have access to this? He asked. No. Has she ever contributed to it directly? Not to the code. She'd suggest features, priorities, client needs, but the implementation, that was always me. Marcus nodded once thoughtfully. Good, he said. That word landed heavier than it should have. He stood again, this time pacing slowly, the way people do when they're fitting pieces together. Here's the problem, he said. And it's a big one. You built the engine, but the company, the legal entity that profits from that engine, is in her name. So the question becomes, did you build it as an employee, a volunteer, or something else entirely? I was never paid, I said. He stopped pacing. Not once, not formally. Everything went back into the company. Or into our shared expenses. Marcus exhaled slowly. That helps, he said. A lot. He returned to his desk, flipped to a clean page on his legal pad, and started writing again. We're not going to argue that you own Vireon outright, he continued. That's a losing battle given the structure. What we're going to argue is that Vireon, as it exists today, cannot be separated from your intellectual and operational contribution. That your role wasn't supportive, it was foundational. Meaning, I asked. Meaning, Marcus said, looking up at me. If she wants to claim the company as solely hers, she has to explain how it functions without the thing that makes it valuable. I understood immediately. The system, I said, the system, he confirmed, and more importantly, your relationship to it. He tapped the laptop. This isn't just evidence that you worked on the company. This is evidence that you are the company in a very real, very uncomfortable way for her legal argument. For the first time since the papers arrived, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just alignment. Like the facts were finally sitting where they were supposed to, but Marcus wasn't done. Do you have communications? He asked. Anything where she acknowledges your role beyond casual conversation. I thought about it for a moment. Emails, I said, messages, early planning documents. She used to be very explicit about things. Used to be, Marcus asked. Before the narrative changed, I replied. He nodded. Find them, all of them. Especially anything tied to major milestones, funding rounds, product launches, key contracts. Judges care about moments where stakes are clear. I hesitated, then added, there might be something else. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Might be, there's a clause, I said slowly. Something we added in year 2 during a contract dispute. It wasn't about ownership, it was about liability. Explain. I leaned forward slightly. One of our early clients wanted assurances, guarantees that the system would perform at a certain level. Elena couldn't provide that on her own, not legally, so we structured a fallback. What kind of fallback? Marcus asked. If the system failed under specific conditions, the liability didn't sit with the company alone, I said. It tied back to the original architect. Marcus went very still. And who, he asked carefully, is listed as the original architect? I am, I said. The room felt different after that, quieter but heavier, like something important had just been placed on the table and neither of us was going to pretend it wasn't there. Marcus leaned back slowly, processing. Is that clause still active? He asked. Yes, across all contracts, every major one, I said. It became standard after the first dispute. Clients liked the added security. Marcus let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. Daniel, he said, do you understand what that means? I think so, I replied. Say it, he said. I held his gaze. It means, I said, that the company's value is tied to me in a way that can't be removed without consequences. Marcus nodded. Exactly, he said. She can claim ownership of the company all she wants. But if the company's core functionality and its contractual obligations depend on you, then we're not just talking about division of assets anymore. What are we talking about? I asked. He smiled then, just slightly. Not the kind of smile that celebrates, the kind that recognizes an opening. We're talking about leverage, he said. The words settled into the room with a quiet kind of finality. For 8 years I had built something and stepped back, letting someone else stand in front of it because I believed that was the right thing to do. I had treated my role as invisible by design, something that didn't need acknowledgement to be real. Now, for the first time, that invisibility was about to become a problem for someone else. Marcus closed the file, tapped it once with his pen, and looked at me with a focus that hadn't been there when I walked in. Go home, he said. Pull everything, every email, every draft, every record you've got. I want a complete timeline by the end of the week. And then, I asked. Then, Marcus replied, we let them make their case. I frowned slightly. Why? Because, he said calmly, the more confident they are that you don't exist, the harder it hits when we prove that you do. I stood, gathering my things, the weight of the situation settling into something clearer, more defined. At the door I paused. There's one more thing, I said. Marcus looked up. She's already started the narrative, I continued. In the filings, in the way her attorney framed everything. I'm not just absent, Marcus. He waited. I'm irrelevant, I said. Marcus considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly. Good, he said. I blinked. Good. Yes, he replied, completely serious. Because irrelevant is the easiest thing in the world to disprove if you have the right evidence. I stepped out of his office into the late afternoon light, the city moving around me in the same steady rhythm it always had. Cars passing, people talking. Life continuing in that indifferent way it does when yours has just shifted direction. 8 years, a company that didn't legally belong to me, a story that had been rewritten without my consent. And now, for the first time, a way to rewrite it back. What Elena didn't understand yet, what she hadn't accounted for in her clean, efficient filing, was that removing someone from paper doesn't erase what they built. It just delays the moment it shows up somewhere else, and that moment was coming. The first hearing was scheduled on a Thursday morning that felt too ordinary for what it was about to hold. There's something unsettling about that, the way life outside a courthouse continues without pause while inside. Entire histories are about to be reduced to statements, objections, and rulings that don't care how things actually felt when they were happening. I arrived 10 minutes early. Marcus was already there, seated at the defense table, a single legal pad in front of him, pen resting exactly parallel to its edge like he'd placed it there with intention. He didn't look up immediately when I approached. That was his way of telling me nothing had changed. Calm wasn't something he performed, it was something he maintained. They're here, he said quietly, eyes still on the pad. I didn't need to ask who. Elena sat at the opposite table, posture straight, expression composed in that familiar way she used when she was about to present something important. Beside her was her attorney, Calvin Rourke. I knew the name before I ever saw the man. Corporate litigation, high-profile clients, a reputation built on precision and control. He wasn't flashy. He didn't need to be. The kind of lawyer who didn't raise his voice because he didn't have to. He was speaking to Elena in low, measured tones, occasionally pointing to a document in front of them. She nodded once, twice, absorbing, aligning. For a moment it felt like watching an old version of us, her at the front, someone else guiding the structure behind it. Only this time I was on the other side of the room. Don't look at her too long, Marcus said without turning. Not yet, I'm not, I replied, even though I had been. He gave a small nod. Good. The judge entered, and the room shifted in that immediate, almost physical way authority creates. Everyone stood, then sat, and just like that it began. Peterson, the clerk paused, checking the file. Reeves versus Marquez, preliminary hearing on asset classification and ownership claims. Rourke stood first. Your Honor, he began, voice steady, unhurried. This is, at its core, a straightforward matter of documented ownership. Vireon Systems, LLC, is and has always been solely owned by my client, Elena Marquez. All corporate filings, intellectual property registrations, and contractual agreements reflect this without ambiguity. He paused, letting the words settle. Mr. Reeves, he continued, with a brief glance in my direction that felt more like acknowledgement of a variable than recognition of a person, was never listed as an owner, officer, or employee of the company. His involvement, while perhaps supportive in a personal capacity, does not rise to the level of legal claim over the business or its assets. There it was, clean, efficient, surgical. I watched Elena as he spoke. She didn't look at me. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on a point just above the judge's bench. If you didn't know better, you'd think she believed every word being said. Maybe she did. Rourke continued. The defense may attempt to reframe informal contributions as foundational involvement, he said. However, the absence of formal agreements, compensation records, or intellectual property filings under Mr. Reeves's name makes such claims speculative at best. He placed a hand lightly on the stack of documents in front of him. The law is clear, Your Honor. Ownership is determined by what is documented, not by retrospective interpretation of personal relationships. He sat down. Marcus didn't move immediately. He let the silence sit for a moment longer than most people would be comfortable with. Then he stood, adjusted his jacket once, and stepped forward. Your Honor, he said, voice calm, almost conversational. Opposing counsel is correct about one thing. This case is about documentation. He turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge their table without fully facing them. What they've presented so far, he continued, is a version of that documentation, incomplete but strategically organized. Rourke didn't react. That told me more than any expression would have. Marcus went on. What we intend to demonstrate, he said, is that Vireon Systems, as it currently exists, cannot be separated from Mr. Reeves's contributions that go far beyond casual support and into the realm of essential function. The judge leaned forward slightly. Not interested yet, just attentive. Marcus didn't push. We're not disputing the formal ownership structure at this stage, he added. We're questioning whether that structure accurately reflects the reality of how this company was built and how it operates. He paused, then sat down. It was a small response, deliberately small, and that was the point. We weren't here to win anything today. We were here to let them talk. The rest of the hearing unfolded exactly the way Marcus had predicted. Rourke laid out their case in detail, timelines, filings, press coverage, everything that painted Elena as the sole architect of Vireon's success. He was careful, precise, never overstating anything. He didn't need to. The absence of my name in every official document did most of the work for him. At one point, he referenced an interview Elena had given the previous year. My vision was always to build something adaptable, she'd said. Something that could evolve faster than the industries it served. Rourke used it as evidence of her leadership, her direction, her role as the driving force behind the company. No mention of who built the system that made that adaptability possible. No mention of the nights that system had nearly collapsed and been rebuilt before morning. No mention of me. I sat there and listened to 8 years of my life being presented as a story that didn't include me, and I understood something in a way I hadn't before. This wasn't just legal strategy. This was narrative control. And Elena had been shaping it long before the divorce papers were filed. The judge asked a few questions, clarifications more than challenges. What was my role exactly? Had I ever received compensation? Were there any written agreements suggesting shared ownership? Rourke answered each one smoothly. Mr. Reeves assisted informally, he said. As spouses often do, there is no record of formal employment or partnership. Marcus didn't object. He wrote something down instead. I didn't ask what. By the time the hearing ended, nothing had been decided. No rulings, no dramatic shifts, just a continuation, a date set for the next phase, and the quiet understanding that both sides would return with more. As we stepped out into the hallway, the air felt different. Thicker, somehow. Conversations echoed off the walls, fragments of other cases blending into a kind of background noise that made everything feel less personal than it was. Marcus walked beside me unhurried. Well, I asked. They're doing exactly what we expected, he said. They made it sound clean, I replied. It is clean, he said. On paper. I stopped walking. And off paper, I asked. He looked at me then, just briefly. That's where we come in. Across the hall, Elena stepped out with Rourke. For a moment our eyes met, not by accident, not this time. There was no anger in her expression, no guilt either. Just something steady, resolved, like she'd already decided how this was going to end. Rourke said something to her. She nodded, then turned and walked in the opposite direction without looking back. I watched her go, feeling something settle into place inside me. Not the kind of feeling you fight, the kind you accept. She believes it, I said quietly. Marcus followed my gaze, then nodded once. She has to, he replied. It's the only version that works for her. And if it works for the court, I asked. Marcus's expression didn't change. Then we make it stop working, he said. That night I sat at my desk with 3 screens open and 8 years of digital history in front of me. Emails, code repositories, contract drafts, internal notes, pieces of a reality that had never been meant to defend anything, only to function. Now they had a different purpose. I started building the timeline Marcus had asked for. Not a summary, not a narrative, a record, every major decision, every system update, every moment where the company could have failed and didn't because of something I had done. It took hours, then more hours. At some point, the city outside went quiet, the kind of late-night stillness that makes everything feel more focused, more precise. I lost track of time the way I used to when I was building Vireon in the beginning, back when the work was the only thing that mattered. Around 3 in the morning, I found something I hadn't been looking for, an old email thread, Year 2, subject line, System Liability Structure. I opened it slowly. Elena had written the first message. If this goes wrong, we need a fallback, something that makes clients feel protected. My reply came 10 minutes later. I can tie performance guarantees to the architecture itself, but that means I'm on the hook, not the company. Her response was immediate, I trust you. I stared at that line longer than I expected to, then I kept reading. The thread continued, details, adjustments, legal language being refined. And then near the end, one sentence that made me sit back in my chair. As long as you're behind it, it can't fail. I leaned back, exhaling slowly. Marcus had called it leverage. He was right, but this wasn't just leverage. This was dependency, not emotional, not implied, documented. I saved the thread, flagged it, added it to the timeline. Then I kept going. Because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't reacting to what Elena had done. I was preparing for what she hadn't accounted for, and the more I dug, the clearer it became. She hadn't accounted for a lot. By the time I walked back into Marcus's office 3 days later, I wasn't carrying a box. I was carrying a system, that's the only way to describe it. Not documents, not files, something structured, layered, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or reinterpret as support. 8 years reduced to timelines, cross-referenced records, version histories, and communication threads that showed not just what I had done, but how the company itself depended on it. Marcus didn't speak when I set the laptop down. He just turned it toward himself and started reading. Minutes passed, then more. At some point, he stopped scrolling. All right, he said quietly. This is no longer a defensive case. I leaned back slightly. What does that mean? It means, he replied, eyes still on the screen, we're not trying to prove you mattered. He looked up. We're going to prove she can't separate from you without breaking what she's trying to keep. That was the shift. Up until now, everything had been about recognition, my role, my contribution, my absence from the official narrative. But Marcus was looking at something else entirely, control. Walk me through the dependency again, he said. I nodded, pulling the chair closer. The core system, the optimization engine, it's not just code. It's structured around a framework that ties performance guarantees to specific architectural decisions. Those guarantees are embedded in contracts. If the system fails to meet certain thresholds, liability triggers. And that liability points to you, Marcus said. Yes, not the company, not directly, I replied. The company facilitates it, but the responsibility traces back to the original architect. Marcus sat back slowly, processing. So if she wants to claim full ownership, he said, she also inherits a system that legally depends on someone she's arguing has no role. Exactly. And if she removes you, I held his gaze. The guarantees collapse, I said. Which means the contracts are exposed. Silence, not the uncertain kind, the kind that settles when something becomes clear. Marcus stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the street below. Do you know what this is? He asked. I didn't answer. This is a fault line, he said. She built her entire case on the idea that you're irrelevant, but her company was built in a way that contradicts that. He turned back toward me. And courts don't like contradictions they can't reconcile. I felt it then, not satisfaction, not even relief, just inevitability, like the outcome had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for someone to point at it clearly enough. So what happens now? I asked. Marcus smiled slightly. Now we give them a choice. The second hearing didn't feel like the first. The room was the same. The judge was the same. Even Elena sat in the same place, posture just as composed, expression just as controlled, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the way Rourke organized his papers. In the way he glanced briefly, almost imperceptibly, at the folder Marcus placed on the table. They knew something was coming, they just didn't know what. Mr. Hale, the judge said, nodding toward Marcus. You indicated you had additional material to present. Marcus stood. Yes, Your Honor. No theatrics, no build-up, just movement. He approached the bench with a small stack of documents, nothing like the overwhelming volume I'd spent nights assembling. That was intentional. Marcus had selected only what mattered. Your Honor, he began. We'd like to clarify the operational structure of Vireon Systems in relation to its contractual obligations. Rourke stood immediately. Objection relevance. This is a matter of ownership, not operational detail. Marcus didn't even look at him. It becomes relevant, he said calmly, when ownership is being asserted over a system that cannot function independently of the party being excluded. The judge paused, considering. Proceed, he said. Marcus nodded once. Exhibit A, he continued, handing over the first document. Standard client agreement used by Vireon Systems for the past 6 years. The judge skimmed it. Section 12, Marcus said, performance liability. A longer pause as the judge read more carefully. And who, the judge asked, is listed as the responsible party? Marcus turned slightly. Daniel Reeves, he said. The room didn't react immediately. That's how you know something lands properly, not with noise, but with stillness. Rourke stepped forward. Your Honor, this is being mischaracterized. These are technical clauses, standard in. Are they standard? Marcus asked quietly. Rourke stopped. Marcus continued. Because we reviewed comparable contracts across the industry, he said, placing another document down. None of them assign liability to an individual outside the company structure. Only Vireon does that, and it does so consistently. The judge looked up now. Mr. Rourke, he said. Rourke adjusted his stance, recalibrating. These clauses reflect early-stage structuring decisions, he said. They don't alter ownership. Agreed, Marcus replied. They don't alter ownership. He let that sit for half a second. They define dependency. That was the word. Dependency. Marcus moved to the next document. Exhibit B, he said. Internal communications regarding system architecture and contractual guarantees. He didn't read everything. He didn't need to. Just one line. As long as you're behind it, it can't fail. Elena's words, in her voice, on paper. I didn't look at her. I didn't have to. You can feel when someone's certainty cracks. It's not loud. It's not visible in some dramatic way. It's subtle. A shift in breathing, a pause that lasts half a second too long. Marcus didn't stop. Your Honor, he said, the plaintiff's position requires the court to accept 2 conflicting claims simultaneously. That Miss Marquez solely owns and operates Vireon Systems, and that the system's core functionality and contractual guarantees rely on an individual who, according to her own filings, has no meaningful role. He stepped back slightly. These claims cannot both be true. Silence again. The judge leaned back, steepling his fingers. Miss Marquez, he said, looking directly at Elena for the first time, can your company fulfill its contractual obligations without Mr. Reeves? There it was, not a legal question. A reality question. Rourke leaned toward her, whispering something quickly. Elena listened, eyes forward, expression tightening just slightly. For the first time since this started, she didn't answer immediately. That hesitation said more than anything she could have said out loud. Marcus returned to the table, calm as ever. He didn't press. He didn't need to, because now it wasn't about proving anything. It was about forcing a decision. The recess was called 15 minutes later. The hallway felt different this time, not heavier, clearer, like something complicated had just been reduced to a single, unavoidable point. Marcus stood beside me, hands in his pockets. They're cornered, he said. Not yet, I replied. He glanced at me. You're right, he said, but they can see the walls now. Across the hall, Elena stood with Rourke. They were speaking quickly, quietly. Strategy, recalibration, damage control. At one point she looked up, not at the room, at me. And for the first time since all of this began, there was no certainty in her expression, just understanding. She knew. Not the legal argument, not the strategy, the truth, that the version of the story she had built couldn't survive what came next. The final session didn't take hours. It didn't need to. By the time we walked back into the courtroom, the case wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about resolving something both sides now understood. Rourke stood first. Your Honor, he said, voice measured but noticeably tighter than before, the parties have engaged in discussion during recess and would like to propose a settlement framework. Marcus didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. The judge nodded. Proceed. Rourke glanced once at Elena, then continued. My client is willing to acknowledge Mr. Reeves's contributions to the development and operation of Vireon Systems in a formal capacity. In exchange, we propose a financial settlement reflective of those contributions. How reflective? Marcus asked calmly. Rourke paused. A structured payout, he said, equivalent to 20% of the company's current valuation. I almost smiled. Not because it was insulting, because it was predictable. Marcus didn't react either. Respectfully, he said, that doesn't address the issue before the court. And what issue is that? Rourke asked. Marcus stepped forward slightly. Whether your client can retain full ownership of an entity that, by its own contracts, cannot function independently of Mr. Reeves. Silence. Again, that word function hung in the air. The judge looked at Elena. Miss Marquez, he said, I'll ask you again, can your company operate as currently structured without Mr. Reeves? This time there was no immediate whisper from Rourke, no quick legal adjustment, just Elena, and the question. She took a breath, then another. No, she said, one word clear, final. It didn't echo, it didn't need to, because everything shifted the moment she said it. Marcus didn't speak right away. He let that answer settle into the record. Then he said very simply, thank you. The rest moved quickly, not rushed, just inevitable. Ownership, as it turned out, wasn't just about whose name was on the documents. It was about what those documents actually meant. And what they couldn't ignore. The final agreement was reached within the hour. 40% equity in Vireon Systems, formally transferred and recognized, board-level authority. A restructuring of contractual language to reflect shared operational responsibility. Not a payout, not a buyout, a correction, on paper, where it should have been from the beginning. The courtroom emptied the same way it always does, quietly, without ceremony, as if something significant hadn't just happened. Marcus packed his things without urgency. "That's it," I asked. "That's it," he said. I nodded. No victory speech. No moment of triumph, just resolution, and strangely, that was enough. I was halfway down the hallway when I heard her. "Daniel." I stopped, turned. Elena stood a few steps behind me, no attorney this time, no documents, no structure, just her. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I didn't think you'd fight it this way." "I didn't think I'd have to," I replied. She nodded slowly. "That's fair." Silence again, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I told myself a story," she said after a moment. "That I built it, that I carried it, that you were part of it but not essential." I didn't respond. She looked at me directly. "I needed that version to be true," she added. "I know," I said, a pause, then quieter, "but it wasn't." That was the closest thing to an apology she was capable of, and I understood that. "I wasn't trying to take it from you," she said. "You were trying to keep it," I replied. She held that for a second, then nodded. "Yes." Another pause. "The system," she said. "You never told anyone. You never asked," I said. That landed. We stood there, 8 years between us, now finally balanced, not repaired, not restored. "Just seen for what it's worth," she said. "You didn't just build the system." I waited. "You built all of it." I let that sit. Then I nodded once. "I know," I said. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, just clearer. Like something that had been misaligned for a long time had finally been set straight. Marcus joined me on the steps. "Disciplined," he said. I glanced at him. "What? That's what you were in there," he said. Not loud, not reactive. "Just disciplined." I thought about that, about the silence, the waiting, the choice to let the truth speak instead of forcing it. "Maybe," I said. He smiled slightly. "Or maybe just patient." We stood there for a moment, watching the city move the way it always does, unaware, unaffected, unchanged. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost, or what I'd proven. Just one thing, simple, clear, true. They tried to erase me from the company I built. But the problem with building something real is that it doesn't disappear just because your name isn't on it. And in the end, that was enough.